to MCNA Prime Time.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome back to our next Seerah lesson. Today we're going to be discussing the formation of Islamic society in Medina after the Prophet ﷺ's hijrah, as well as the Battle of Badr, which was the first battle in the history of Islam.
رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. ربي زدني علما.
So the first thing we're going to be discussing is how the Prophet structured an Islamic society. As you all know from the last lesson, the Prophet and many other Muslims from Quraysh made hijrah to Medina, where they would be able to live openly as Muslims without fear of persecution. So we're going to talk about that transition a little bit. The Prophet arrived in Medina on Friday Rabiul Awwal the 12th in the first year of Hijrah. AH means after Hijrah, which speaks to the significance of this event because it's what our entire Islamic calendar is based on. People greatly anticipated his arrival and celebrated with extreme excitement and delight when they finally saw him. They sung this very popular song that we're going to listen to on the next slide.
البدر علينا من ثنيات الوداع وجب الشكر علينا ما دعا لله
The Prophet's first task in Medina was to establish the masjid. The Prophet's masjid was built where his camel knelt. When he arrived, everyone was pulling at the Prophet, pulling at his camel, asking them to come stay with them, because obviously that would be a great honor. But he told them to let the she-camel follow her path, for she is guided by Allah. So eventually the camel did kneel, and the land where the masjid was to be built belonged to two orphan boys, and the Prophet ﷺ purchased the land from them. And he resided temporarily in the house of Abu Ayyub Ansari, who was very clever, and instead of pulling at the Prophet's camel, he took the saddle off of the camel and started taking it to his home. And the Prophet ﷺ jokingly said that he has to go where his saddle is. Construction of the masjid began, and the walls were made with unbaked bricks of dirt and mud. The roof was constructed from branches and leaves to provide shade, and the tree trunks inside the masjid served as its pillars. The Prophet's house was constructed next to the masjid, and they also built a place called the Sufa, and this was a place for poor, unmarried, or unemployed companions that would basically spend time with the Prophet and memorize ayat from the Quran as they were revealed. Abu Huraira, who is known for narrating several hadith, was actually one of the companions that spent a lot of time being educated in Sufas. The Qibla was originally towards Bayt al-Maqdis in Jerusalem until later on when an ayah revealed that the Qibla was to be changed to the direction of the Kaaba in Mecca. A photo of a diorama of what the Prophet's masjid would have looked like when it was originally constructed. As you can see, the Qibla is towards Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, which was also the Qibla of the Jewish tribes living in Medina at that time. The Prophet's house is on the side, and the Sufa is located at the back. And this is what it looked like after the Qibla was changed. So the Sufa was now on the other side, the Qibla was towards the Kaaba, and the Prophet's house was still where it was. The ayah commanding the change of the Qibla was actually revealed while they were in prayer. So within the prayer, the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims behind him literally turned from one direction to another. The ayah that commanded the change in Qibla is actually known as Ayatul Bir, or the verse of righteousness. It's in Surah Baqarah, it's ayah 177, and in it Allah subhanahu says, "Righteousness is not that you turn your faces towards the east or the west, but true righteousness is in one that believes in Allah, the last day, the angels, the book, and the prophets, who gives wealth in spite of loving it to relatives, orphans, the needy, the traveler, those who ask for help and for freeing slaves, who establishes salah and gives zakah, who fulfill their promises when they promise, and who are patient in poverty, hardship, and during battle. Those are the ones who have been true, and it is those who are the righteous." And one of the reasons that this ayah was revealed was because there were some Jewish people in Medina that were saying arrogantly that Muslims were establishing this new religion from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but still facing the same Qibla as them, and in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that facing a certain direction is not what makes a person righteous. What makes a person righteous is the right belief, the right actions, and the right character. And the coalescence of these three traits is what makes a person righteous. Now we're going to discuss a little bit about the people of Medina. There were three main groups that coexisted together in Medina. The first were Arab Madanese polytheist tribes, the second were Jewish tribes, and the last was Muslim tribes. So first we're going to look at the Arab Madanese polytheist tribes. So of the Arab polytheistic tribes, some of them were neutral towards Islam and the Prophet ﷺ, so they didn't accept Islam, but they weren't really opposed to it either. And some of them were inclined towards Islam, and eventually they did embrace it. And some of the Arab polytheist tribes inwardly harbored evil intentions toward the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims, but outwardly they had to act friendly or even like Muslims, so i.e. they were hypocrites. One of the biggest hypocrites in Medina was Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul, and he was the head of two tribes, Aus and Khazraj, and these two tribes used to harbor a lot of animosity and hatred towards each other before the Prophet's arrival in Medina. They were eventually integrated into the Ansar, which we will discuss shortly. So Aus and Khazraj were Muslim tribes. They accepted Islam before the Prophet's hijrah to Medina, but their head Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul was known to us as the head of the hypocrites in Medina. The Prophet ﷺ always knew who the hypocrites were, but he was never vengeful and he never exposed anyone until they committed a clear act of disbelief or betrayal that harmed the Muslims. Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul would stir up whispers and evil suggestions whenever possible. He would try to create fights between Muslims. He would try to separate brothers in faith. And he would also secretly plot with Quraysh and polytheistic tribes that hated the Prophet ﷺ. And he would try to tempt and mislead new converts to Islam. So just generally, he was a really bad dude. And actually, the punishment for hypocrisy in Islam is more intense than the punishment for disbelief. And there's a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ who says that there's 4 characteristics that if anyone possesses them, he possesses a characteristic of hypocrisy until he abandons it. And these 4 characteristics are: when he talks, he lies; when he makes a promise, he violates it; when he makes a covenant, he acts treacherously; and when he quarrels, he deviates from the truth. So it's important as Muslims to ensure that we have none of these qualities, and it also emphasizes how horrible of a sin hypocrisy is. And that was the Arab polytheist tribes. Now we're going to discuss the Jewish tribes. So there were 3 main Jewish tribes that lived in Medina after the Prophet ﷺ's migration. The first was Banu Qaynuqa. They were allied with the Khazraj tribe. The second were Banu Nadir, and the third were Banu Qurayza, and they were allied with Aus. We're not going to talk too much about these tribes in this lesson, but they will be important later on, so just keep them in mind. One of the first interactions the Prophet ﷺ had with the Jewish tribes was right after his hijrah, when he was approached by the most learned rabbi in Medina, whose name was Abdullah bin Salam. Abdullah bin Salam had heard that someone claiming to be a prophet was going to be arriving in Medina, and being very learned in the Jewish religion, he knew that they were expecting another prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to appear, and he went to ascertain whether this person was truly a messenger, and he asked the Prophet ﷺ a couple of questions, and within minutes he knew that the Prophet ﷺ truly was a messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he accepted Islam. But he told the Prophet ﷺ that if you tell my people that I accepted Islam, they're not going to speak favorably of me, and they'll tell lies about me. So the Prophet ﷺ summoned the Jewish people, and he asked them, who is this man Abdullah bin Salam? And all of them affirmed that he was knowledgeable and righteous and wise. And so when the Prophet ﷺ revealed that he has accepted Islam and accepted me as the messenger of God, they all said the exact opposite of what they just said about him, and they abandoned him. Nevertheless, it was still pretty significant that the Prophet ﷺ was immediately accepted by one of the most learned Jewish leaders in Medina at that time. So now we're going to discuss the Muslim tribes in Medina. The first Muslim tribe that we're going to talk about is Al-Ansar, which literally means the helpers. They were settled, wealthy, and they accepted Islam while already living in Medina. So these were the people that were native to Medina, and they were Muslims. From the name, you might be wondering, who did they help? So this brings us to our second Muslim tribe, Al-Muhajirun, which translates to the emigrants. These were the Muslims that had to flee persecution and oppression in Mecca. So when they arrived in Medina, they were penniless, they were unemployed, a lot of them were weak. Most of them left everything behind because they had to escape in a hurry. So they didn't have any food, they didn't have any clothes, no livestock, no possessions, almost nothing. After the Hijrah, there were a lot of emigrant Muslims that were joining the Ansar in Medina, and in the pre-Islamic era, Arabs were incredibly tribalistic, and they were obsessed with things like lineage, family, and clanship, and those sort of allegiances were deeply discouraged in Islam. So one of the most important things when establishing an Islamic society was establishing brotherhood. So in this next section, we're just going to take a look at how the Prophet ﷺ did that, and how it was received by both sides. So how did the Prophet establish brotherhood? The first thing he did was he sort of paired off an Ansari with a Muhajir, and he made them brothers in faith. So they were supposed to help each other and support each other, and they did that as if they were family. In fact, they embraced each other despite being from separate clans, separate families, separate cities. They supported each other so much that they were actually allowed to inherit from each other. So if one of them passed away, they were allowed to inherit as if they were related, until a verse in the Quran was revealed that ended this practice and limited inheritance to blood relation. That's how close the brothers in faith were. Sa'd ibn Rabi'a was one of the wealthiest members of the Ansar, and he actually offered half of his wealth to his brother in faith, Abdurrahman bin Auf, who was a Muhajir. And despite this generosity, Abdurrahman bin Auf he refused, and he said, just tell me where the market is, because he was a merchant and he wanted to make his own living, and he eventually did, and he was able to make money and get married and settle in Medina. One of the most precious commodities in Medina were date groves, and that was actually how the Ansar made most of their money, and it was their highest yielding product in trade. And the Ansar actually approached the Prophet ﷺ, and they offered to donate half of their date groves to the Muhajirin, because they knew that a lot of them left their livestock and they left their farms in Mecca, so they wanted to donate their date groves so that the Muhajirin could make money off of them. The Prophet ﷺ didn't want to burden the Ansar too much, so instead the Muhajirin were able to work alongside the Ansar in the date groves, and they split the yields equally, which was a kind of cooperation that was never seen before in the Arab world, because they were very competitive in trade and in being the best clan and all of that stuff that we discussed before. So the only thing that connected them was their religion. Things like race, wealth, and status were below. They weren't considered as important as the fact that they were both Muslim. In Mecca, the Muslims were scattered, they were poor, weak, and they had no voice or power to live their lives the way they wanted. They strove to establish the key tenets of their faith in Mecca. So things like Shahada, rejecting shirk, and establishing Salah. That's actually why most Meccan surahs, the surahs that were revealed to the Prophet ﷺ while he was in Mecca, they pertain to things such as the oneness of God and how he should be worshipped, etc. Thanks to the selfless spirit of brotherhood in Medina, they could now establish a new homeland and live life in accordance with Allah's rules. So they could find work and raise their families in peace without worrying about being rejected or shunned or economically cut off like they were in Mecca. And most Madani surahs are actually about these kinds of topics. So challenges pertaining to society, economics, politics, and ethics, and like the specifics of worship and the technicalities. And this was actually a great blessing to be able to worry about these things instead of just worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and trying to survive. So This was thanks to that spirit of brotherhood that the Muhajirun and the Ansar embraced and implemented, and that's why the Islamic society in Medina was able to prosper. In addition to brotherhood, the people of Medina implemented a lot of virtues, merits, and values that were held in high regard in their society based on the teachings and hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, including extend salam amongst yourselves, provide food to the needy, maintain your blood relations, and observe the night prayers. The Muslim is one from whose tongue and hands the Muslims are safe, so not harming your fellow believers with either your speech or your actions. None amongst you truly believes until he likes for his brother what he likes for himself, and he is not a perfect believer who goes to bed full and knows that his neighbor is hungry. So looking out for each other was very, very important. Charity erases sins just as water extinguishes fire, so looking out for the people that are needy and don't have as much as you. Please keep in mind these are not directly quoted hadith, but you can find them with their sources on page 121 of The Sealed Nectar, which is a biography of the Prophet ﷺ's life, if you are interested in further study. Now we're going to discuss the Constitution of Medina, which was a legal charter that ratified the alliances of all tribes in Medina and listed the rules and values that they would all abide by. And we're not going to cover the whole thing because it was quite long, but we'll look at some of the key points in the next few slides. The charter pertained to all tribes coexisting within Medina, so all of the non-Muslim Arab tribes, the Muslim tribes, and the Jewish tribes. Some of the key provisions were the following. Tribes will come to each other's aid if attacked by a third party. None shall commit sins of prejudice against another. All of the signatories to the charter will commercially boycott Quraysh and abstain from extending them support. And finally, autonomy and freedom of religion. So this is the summary of the full Constitution of Medina. As you can see, it's still quite long, even though it's just a summary. But it basically had different provisions for all of the citizens, for just the Muslims, and for just the non-Muslims and the Jewish tribes. But the point is that everyone signed it, and they all agreed to coexist according to the laws and the provisions that were set forth in this constitution. Alright, now we can start talking about the events that preceded the Battle of Badr. There were a few, so let's begin. Soon after the Constitution of Medina was ratified, Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul, the head of the hypocrites in Medina, received a secret ultimatum from Quraysh. In this message, the leaders of Quraysh commanded Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul to either fight or expel the Prophet, otherwise Quraysh would fight him. Since the Prophet ﷺ arrived and ratified the Constitution of Medina, Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul was bitter over losing his dominion over Aus and Khazraj. Before the Prophet ﷺ arrived, he was in charge and he could command them to do as he pleased. And now that the Prophet ﷺ was essentially head of state, he had no more power. So he was pretty bitter and he agreed to the Quraysh's demands. He began mobilizing his supporters, but before anything could happen, the Prophet ﷺ was informed and he was able to talk Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul down. His followers were either too embarrassed or too reasonable to attempt any coup against the Prophet, but Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul remained a secret ally of Quraysh and members of the Jewish tribes that wished the Prophet ﷺ harm. One of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, Sa'ad bin Mu'adh, expressed an intention to go to Mecca and perform Umrah, and he was accompanied by another companion, Umayyah bin Khalaf. When they got to Mecca, however, he was prevented from entering the vicinity of the Kaaba by Abu Jahl, who said that he would have killed Sa'ad if Umayyah bin Khalaf wasn't protecting him. In return, Sa'ad bin Mu'adh threatened to cut off Mecca's caravans if any harm came to them. They returned to Medina in peace, but things were very tense as Quraysh had sent a message threatening to kill the Muslims in their new homeland. So the Prophet ﷺ verified this information from reliable sources and learned that Quraysh was indeed plotting something. So things were quite stressful from this point on. The Prophet Muhammad issued a state of alert in Medina as things were very tense. One night he awoke to the sound of clanging arms and he asked what was happening outside. And when he looked, it was Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, and he was serving as his sentry, as a guard, because he feared that harm would come to the Prophet while he slept. And the Prophet ﷺ thanked him and made dua for him and went back to sleep. Eventually, however, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the following ayah.
والله يعصمك من الناس إن الله لا يهدي القوم الكافرين.
After this ayah was revealed, the Prophet Muhammad dismissed Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and all the other Muslims outside of his house, and things were a little bit less tense than they were before, now that the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was guaranteed. Soon after, another verse was revealed that gave the Muslims permission to fight those that fought against them, and this was the ayah.
أذن للذين يقاتلون بأنهم ظلموا وإن الله على نصرهم لقدير.
The goal was to bring trade routes to Mecca under the control of the Muslims in Medina, and this would be accomplished in two ways. The first was to make peace treaties with the nearby tribes adjacent to those trade routes, and we know that the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims had already made several peace treaties with their neighboring tribes in Medina. The second way was to deploy successive missions along those routes to intercept various caravans. So these were not really battles, at most they could be described as skirmishes. Why was it necessary to control the trade routes to Mecca? Well, firstly, keep in mind that Mecca was trading off a lot of the possessions and wealth that the Muhajirin left behind when they made Hijrah. Second, the power and strategy displayed by these missions would have a few results. One, it would deter the Quraysh from military action that could jeopardize the Muslims' livelihoods in Medina. Two, it would force Quraysh to cease persecution of Muslims still detained in Mecca. Finally, having control of the trade routes would allow the Prophet ﷺ to do dawah to any caravans that passed those trade routes, and this was ultimately his main mission. So now we're going to discuss some of these pre-Badr missions that were specifically aimed at intercepting various caravans on the trade routes. The first mission took place in Ramadan in the first year of Hijrah, and it was led by Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib, the Prophet's uncle, who took 30 Muhajirin to intercept a Quraysh caravan. When they got there, the clash was prevented by Majdi bin Amr, who was on good terms with both parties, so no fighting actually broke out. And it was in this mission that the Prophet ﷺ accredited the Muslims their first flag, and this flag was white in color. The second mission took place in the first year of Hijrah in the month of Shawwal, and it was led by Ubayd bin Harith, who led 60 Muhajirin to intercept a Quraysh caravan. They reached a place called Batan Rabah, and they exchanged arrows with a caravan of over 200 men. Nobody was killed, and there was no actual fighting aside from this exchange of arrows. The third mission took place in Dhul Qaida in the first year of the Hijrah. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas led 20 horsemen to intercept a camel caravan from Quraysh. They rode for 5 days and they reached Al-Kharar, but the Quraysh caravan had already left, so they returned. The fourth mission took place in Safar in the second year of Hijrah. The Prophet ﷺ himself led 70 men to intercept a camel caravan from Quraysh. They reached a place called Wadan, but the Quraysh caravan had already left. Instead of returning to Medina right away, the Prophet ﷺ met with the nearby clan of Banu Damra and made a peace treaty with them, and this ensured mutual cooperation, support, and safety between Medina and Wadan. The fifth mission took place in Rabiul Awwal in the second year of the Hijrah, and the Prophet ﷺ again led 200 men to a place called Buwat to intercept a caravan, but the caravan had already left by the time they arrived, so they returned to Medina. In the same month, Rabiul Awwal in the second year of the Hijrah, a group of disbelievers led by a man named Garz bin Jabir raided the pastures and looted animals in Medina. In response to this, the Prophet ﷺ led 70 men until they reached Safwan near Badr, but they were unable to catch up with the looters and they had to return to Medina, but this was considered the preliminary event that led to the Battle of Badr. So this mission was actually a response. They were trying to catch up with the group of disbelievers that had stolen the animals from Medina. The seventh mission took place across the months Jamad al-Ula and Jamad al-Ukhra in the second year of the Hijrah. The Prophet ﷺ led 150 to 200 men to intercept a Quraysh caravan. They were able to reach the place called Dhul Ushayra, but the caravan had already left before they arrived. The Prophet ﷺ made a peace treaty with Bani Madlij, a nearby tribe, before he returned to Medina. The eighth and last mission before the Battle of Badr took place in Rajab in the second year of the Hijrah. Abdullah bin Jahash Asadi led 12 Muhajirun and was given a letter by the Prophet and told only to read it after they had been riding for 2 days. When he read it, it said to go to a place between Mecca and Taif called Nakhla and intercept a caravan that was headed to Quraysh and to determine their intentions. When they reached the caravan, they were not sure if they should engage, as it was the month of Rajab. Even in pre-Islamic times, the months of Rajab, Ramadan, Dhul-Qa'dah, and Dhul-Hijjah were considered sacred, and war was prohibited even for Quraysh. Eventually, after debating amongst themselves, the Muslims decided to engage and took 2 prisoners and collected some booty from the caravan. When they returned to Medina, the Prophet ﷺ disapproved of both acts and suspended action against the prisoners and the camels. The Quraysh took advantage of the Muslims' mistake and vilified them in the eyes of their fellow tribes for breaking the sanctity of the month of Rajab. Eventually, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this ayah concerning this matter.
يسألونك عن الشهر الحرام قتال فيه قل قتال فيه كبير وصد عن سبيل الله وكفر به والمسجد الحرام وإخراج أهله منه أكبر عند الله والفتنة أكبر من القتل.
Essentially, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in this verse is that Quraysh had committed far worse transgressions, like persecuting weak Muslims, forcing them out of their home, preventing access to the Kaaba, and targeting the Messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So finally, we can start discussing the Battle of Badr. As you guys are aware, this was the first major battle in the history of Islam, and it had major consequences for both Quraysh and the Muslims and how it affected the rest of their interactions. In Ramadan, in the second year of Hijrah, 2 scouts overseeing the trade routes reported that Abu Sufyan was headed to Syria with a caravan worth 50,000 dinar, and that it was only guarded by 40 men and it was passing near Medina. Keep in mind that the Quraysh was trading the wealth and the property the Muhajirun were forced to leave behind in Mecca, and 50,000 dinar at that time was worth approximately $100,000 in this time. Upon hearing this news, the Prophet ﷺ urged the Muslims to intercept the caravan so they could make up some of their wealth, and they departed Medina with 313 men. They weren't particularly well equipped. They only had 2 horses and 70 camels, which they took turns riding in groups of 3. They marched towards Badr, and they sent 2 scouts to find Quraysh's camels when they reached As-Safra. Abu Sufyan, however, on his way back from Syria with the caravan, heard about this, and he paid someone to quickly ride ahead and tell Quraysh to send reinforcements. The man that he paid rode really, really quickly to Quraysh. He was really theatrical. He tore his shirt from the front and the back. He injured his camel. He turned the saddle upside down. He ran into the nobles of Quraysh and he said, "Oh Quraysh, your merchandise is being intercepted by the Prophet. I don't know what's happening to your stuff." Upon hearing this, all of Quraysh's nobles mustered their full force and called on their allies. They set out with 1,300 soldiers, 100 horses, and plenty of camels. Before they left, they were a little bit hesitant to leave Makkah as they feared a rival clan might attack them from behind. However, Iblis appeared disguised as Suraka bin Malik, who was the chief of another clan, and assured them that they would not be attacked. So Shaitan himself was a part of this battle. While marching towards Badr, they received a message from Abu Sufyan saying he was safe, because what he'd done was he led the caravan away from the valley of Badr and he took it the long way around the Red Sea. So here is a map that will demonstrate what happened with the caravan. The original route of the caravan was back from Syria through the valley of Badr and straight on towards Mecca. However, since the Muslim army was waiting to ambush the caravan in the valley of Badr, Abu Sufyan took the caravan south and fled towards the Red Sea, meaning that they were out of danger and the reinforcements that he'd sent for from Quraysh were technically no longer needed. When Abu Jahl heard that the interception had been avoided, he arrogantly insisted that the army proceed to Badr anyways and hold 3 nights of festivities and worship of their idols. He wanted to show off in front of the Muslim forces that they could stay for 3 nights with food and entertainment and resources even when it wasn't necessary. And he boasted that the Arabs will hear how we marched forth and of our mighty gathering, and they will stand in awe of us forever. So just trying to increase, their own status in the eyes of the fellow polytheistic Arabs. Two clans, Banu Zuhra and Banu Adi, could not be persuaded to stay, so they left. So the remaining 1,000 soldiers proceeded to the valley of Badr, and they set up camp at Udwatul Quswa. And Abu Sufyan and the men with the caravan also joined the Meccan army. So this is just another map of the Valley of Badr, and this particularly is where the Meccan army set up their camp. Medina's scouts reported Quraysh's activities to the Prophet, and the Muslim army was a little bit concerned that Quraysh's army could still march on Medina at any moment if they decided to. So the Prophet ﷺ held a meeting to apprise everyone of the gravity of the situation and to ask for their counsel. Companions from the Muhajirun and the Ansar voiced their support and obedience for whatever the Prophet decided. Specifically, Al-Miqdad bin Amr said, O Messenger of Allah, proceed where Allah directs you to, for we are with you. We will not say to you like the children of Israel said to Musa, go you and your Lord and fight, and we will stay here. Rather, we will say, go you and your Lord and fight, and we will fight along with you. The Prophet ﷺ wanted to hear from the Ansar because it was kind of obvious that the Muhajirun would want to fight the Meccans because they had a bone to pick since they were persecuted and forced to flee their homeland. And Sa'd bin Mu'adh realized that the Prophet ﷺ wanted to hear from the Ansar, and the Prophet ﷺ said, yes, please tell me your opinion. And Sa'd said, O Prophet of Allah, we believe in you, and we testify that you are the true messenger of Allah. We bear witness that what you have been given is the truth. We give you our firm pledge of obedience and sacrifice. We will obey you most willingly in whatever you command us, and by Allah who has sent you with truth, if you ask us to cross this sea, we will do that most readily, and not a man of us will stay behind. We hope that Allah will show you through our hands those deeds of courage which will please your eyes. Kindly lead us to the battlefield in the name of Allah. So the Prophet ﷺ made the decision, and he sent Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Al-Zubair al-Awwam as scouts, and they were able to ascertain the army's exact location and numbers. Additionally, Allah SWT sent rain, and it was made beneficial for the Muslims' camp and unbeneficial for the Quraysh. In fact, the next morning when they had to bring their horses up the mountain, it was extremely difficult for the Quraysh because it was all wet and slippery, and there was actually an ayah revealed about this.
إذ يغشيكم النعاس أمنة منه وينزل عليكم من السماء ماء ليطهركم به ويذهب عنكم رجز الشيطان وليربط على قلوبكم ويثبت به الأقدام.
As we just heard in the verse, the Muslims attained a good night's rest and a strong resolve, which, if you think about it, was a really big blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because imagine if they were up the whole night stressing about the fact that they were going to battle with an army so much larger than them, they wouldn't have gotten any rest, and it just wouldn't have been good the next day. The Prophet originally intended to set up camp at the well that was nearest to the spring of Badr, and a companion named Al-Hubab bin Mundar asked the Prophet ﷺ if Allah had inspired him to choose that location or if it was a stratagem of war and he was counseled. When the Prophet ﷺ said that it was the latter, Al-Hubab advised that they not encamp there, and instead they set up camp at the well nearest to Quraysh's army, make a basin or a reservoir full of water, and destroy the other wells on Quraysh's side. And the Prophet ﷺ approved of this strategy, and they carried it out at midnight, and this was very useful in the battle later on. Sa'd bin Mu'adh also suggested that the Prophet ﷺ be built a trellis, which is a kind of raised platform from which he could see and give orders to the entire Muslim army. And this also had the added benefit, if things took a turn for the worse, the Prophet ﷺ would be able to attain safe passage back to Medina, and so this was also implemented. The Battle of Badr took place on Friday, Ramadan 17th in the second year of Hijrah. The Prophet ﷺ woke up at Fajr, he led the Muslims in prayer, and with a small arrow in his hand, he arranged the army into flanks. There were 3 flanks and 2 battalions. So the 2 battalions were of the Ansar and the Muhajirun. The leader of the Ansar was Sa'd bin Mu'adh, and of the Muhajirun was Ali bin Abi Talib. The right flank was under the command of Az-Zubair bin al-Awwam, and the left flank was under the command of Al-Miqdad bin Amr. These two companions were actually the two that owned the only two horses in the entire army. And the rear flank was under the command of Qais bin Abi Sa'sa'a. So Quraysh's scouts reported that the opposing Muslim army was looking very, very keen on engaging in this battle, despite the fact that they were outnumbered 3-1, and this kind of made Quraysh's soldiers really uneasy. And in response, Abu Jahl started reminding them of the men that they lost at Nakhla, and he spread attacks on the Prophet to try and rouse his army's spirit. So this is yet another map of the Valley of Badr, where the Battle of Badr took place. We're looking at the Muslim army. They were arranged in ranks according to their weapons. So some of them had spears, bows, arrows, some of them had swords. They only had 70 camels, so a lot of them were on the ground, on their feet. And they weren't really well prepared because remember, they weren't expecting a battle when they left Medina, just an interception of a caravan. And second, this was the first military battle in the history of the Muslims. So they weren't really well equipped, but they were very experienced, they were very disciplined, and they were very strategic. You can see next to them is the only remaining reservoir in the entire valley. All the other wells on the Quraysh side, near Udbat al-Quswa, near their camp, all of those wells were defunct, they weren't working. And so the only way that anyone could get water would be to approach the Prophet's camp. The Meccan army, on the other hand, had more in number. They were 3 times larger. They had more experience, more equipment, and all of their nobles and leaders were present. They didn't actually want to be there, but they were convinced by Abu Jahl to stay and gain notoriety amongst other tribes and clans by waging war against the Prophet ﷺ. But even though they were so much larger than the Muslim army, they were still feeling uneasy, and this was because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not give them any assurance. In fact, in Surah Anfal, ayah 19, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the disbelievers directly and says, "Your forces will be of no avail to you, however numerous, and verily Allah is with the believers." A few soldiers from Quraysh made multiple attempts to reach the well on Al-Udwat al-Dunya, the Muslim side, and they weren't able to until an idolater named Abdul Asad al-Makhzumi swore by all of his idols that he would either drink from the water basin of the Muslims or die. And he was actually defeated in combat by Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib, and he did die. And this was technically the first combat in the battle. It was custom at that time to have a couple one-on-one duels before both armies launched their offensive or defensive attacks. So when they saw Abdul Asad al-Makhzumi die, 3 of the Quraysh stepped forward. These 3 were Utbah bin Rabi'a, his brother Shayba, and his son Walid. And they stepped forward and immediately started cursing and taunting the Muslims, challenging them to fight. And they asked for their champions, and immediately 3 young Ansari Muslims stepped forward. And their names were Abdullah bin Rawaha, Auf bin Harith, and his brother Muadda bin Harith. However, Quraysh didn't want to fight the youngsters. They actually wanted to fight members of the Muhajirin, so the people that used to be from their own clan. And so they told them to go back and send forth your superiors. So at this, Ubaidah bin Harith, Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib, and Ali ibn Abi Talib stepped forward for combat. And very quickly, Shayba was defeated by Hamza, and Walid was defeated by Ali. Ubaidah was wounded by Utbah, but Hamza eventually defeated him, and Ubaidah had to have his leg amputated, and he died a few days later of an infection, so he was granted martyrdom in the Battle of Badr. After the main duels, the fighting began, and the Muslim army held a strong defensive position. The Prophet ﷺ had advised using ranged combat methods as much as possible, so things from afar, things like arrows and spears, and not to melee or directly engage in duels until absolutely necessary. So their strategy was to be on the defense, and it was a very disciplined defensive position. The Prophet ﷺ spent the entire night before and most of the battle praying facing the Qibla, and he raised his hands in dua the whole time. It was actually customary for when you're making a very strong dua, you raise your hands as much as possible. And the Prophet ﷺ raised his hands so high that his cloak fell off his shoulders, and he made a very emotional dua. He said, "O Allah, grant me what you have promised me. Should this group be defeated today, you will no longer be worshipped on this earth." And he made dua with such frequency and with such sincerity that he was shaking, and like we said, his cloak fell until Abu Bakr came. He picked it up, he put it back on the shoulders of the Prophet, and he said, "O Messenger of Allah, you have cried enough to your Lord. He will surely fulfill what he has promised you." Allah indeed fulfilled his promises. So there were two ayahs that corresponded to this.
إذ تستغيثون ربكم فاستجاب لكم أني ممدكم بألف من الملائكة مردفين سيهزم الجمع ويولون الدبر.
The Prophet turned to his companion and said, "O Abu Bakr, glad tidings are here for you. Allah's victory has approached. By Allah, I can see Jibreel on his mare in a sandstorm." The Prophet picked up some dust and flung it towards Quraysh's army and said, "Confusion seized their faces." And suddenly a huge sandstorm started blowing towards the Quraysh, which reduced their visibility, caused them confusion and panic, and I'm pretty sure everyone knows what it's like to get sand in their eyes, but it doesn't feel good. And this allowed the Muslims to switch to an offensive position, and they were able to break the ranks and the formation of Quraysh's army. And in regards to the sandstorm, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this ayah.
وما رميت إذ رميت ولكن الله رمى.
After a successful counterattack by the Muslims with the help of the sandstorm from Allah and his angels, the Quraysh army began to flee. They left their armors, weapons, tents, camels, horses, family members, everything behind. Abu Jahl was appalled, and he tried to get them to stop by appealing to their pride and tribalism, but it was too late, and he was abandoned on the battlefield. In fact, he was slain by Mu'ad bin Amr and Muwadda bin Arfa, and these were two young Muslims who were not even that experienced in battle. And later on, after the battle was over, the Prophet ﷺ looked at his body and he said, "This is the Fir'aun of this nation," which really drives home how evil this man was. Iblis, who was still disguised as Suraka bin Malik, ran into the sea upon seeing the angels helping the Muslims, because he was a jinn, so he could see the angels, and he was so terrified that he ran away from Jibreel saying, "I have been appointed a term," and he ran into the sea because he was so scared. In the end, over 24 notables and leaders of Quraysh were defeated, and after the battle was over, the Prophet ﷺ actually addressed each of them and said whose Lord was right and who was granted victory. And Abu Bakr actually asked him, "Are you talking to people that are dead?" And the Prophet ﷺ said that they can hear me, but they can't respond. So the aftermath of the battle was as such. There were 70 casualties on the Quraysh's side, and 70 of them were taken prisoner. On the Muslim side, 14 Muslims attained martyrdom in the Battle of Badr. When the news reached Mecca, the remaining nobles were in disbelief upon hearing about their army's defeat. Nobody expected that a force of 1,000 people could ever lose to an army as small as 300. And Abu Lahab was so enraged that he abused a Muslim, Abu Rafi, and this actually upset al-Fadl, and she ended up hitting him in the head with a log, and he died a little bit later, and his body was covered in boils that smelled so bad that his own sons couldn't approach him to bury him, and instead they just kind of threw rocks at him until he was covered in. This was the first battle in the history of Islam, so it was also the first time that they were dealing with the spoils of war, and a few disagreements broke out between the Muslims concerning the spoils of war. So remember how we said that the disbelievers left behind everything like their armor, tents, weapons, camels, horses, etc.? That is referred to as the spoils of war. And they're in a hadith narrated by Ubaidah bin Samit. When the battle turned and was won, some continued to pursue the army. Some of the Muslims started collecting spoils from their camp, and some Muslims stayed and guarded the Prophet just in case there was a turn in the tide or if there was a surprise attack from any direction. These three groups were all disagreeing over who deserves the spoils of war, because the people that were fighting said that you were only able to collect the booty because we were fighting, and the people that collected it said that you wouldn't have this if we didn't collect it. And the people guarding the Prophet said that we guarded the Prophet, which is arguably the most important task, so we're also entitled to it. So on the way back to Medina, the Prophet ﷺ distributed these spoils equally amongst the soldier after taking al-khums, which is 1/5, and this is because all spoils of war, 1/5 goes to Allah and the Prophet, and that is typically to charity. When the Prophet Muhammad returned to Medina with his companions, several people ended up accepting Islam after hearing of the Prophet's victory against Quraysh. The prisoners that were brought back to Medina were treated with care and respect. They were given bread while their captors ate dates, so they got the more nutritious part of the meal, and they were given beasts to ride while their captors walked alongside of them. The prisoners were ransomed based on their financial ability, so whatever their families in Quraysh could afford to pay, and it ranged between 1,000 and 4,000 dinar. Some prisoners were freed if they agreed to teach 10 children in Medina to read and write, because a lot of the Muhajirin's children were poor and they couldn't afford an education in Mecca, so this was a way of getting them to become literate. And some prisoners were freed if Quraysh agreed to free Muslim prisoners in Mecca in return. And this was the case for the Prophet's daughter's husband, so his son-in-law, was released if he agreed to let the Prophet's daughter migrate to Medina, which he did. Okay, so that was the Battle of Badr. Congratulations on making it this far. You have officially covered one of the major battles in Islam. The victory that the Muslims attained here was very significant, and it shaped the rest of the Prophet Muhammad's mission in his life, to call people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we're going to look at some of the lessons that we learned from this battle. Okay, so the first lesson that we learn is that numbers don't mean anything, and there is an ayah from Surah Baqarah.
كم من فئة قليلة غلبت فئة كثيرة بإذن الله.
So essentially what this ayah is saying is that it doesn't matter how many enemies are opposing you. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permits you to be victorious, then you will be victorious. This ayah itself is actually taken from a story involving Dawood alayhi salam. And many times in the Quran, in the stories of prophets before Muhammad sallam, and in the Prophet's Seerah, in the battles after Badr, this concept repeats itself, where there's a small force, but because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted them to win, they overcome any hardship or any consequence that's in their way. The second lesson we learn is that victory is only through Allah, so we should only pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us victorious.
وما النصر إلا من عند الله إن الله عزيز حكيم.
So from this ayah we learn that victory is not dependent on how many soldiers you have, how skilled they are, if you have a geological advantage, if you have more horses, or if you have better weapons. Victory is only attained if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wills it. And you know how before we said that numbers don't mean anything, so if you have a small force you can win if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows it. It's actually also the same for the opposite. So in future battles in the Seerah, you'll see that sometimes the Muslims were in a larger number than the disbelievers and they lost. Another lesson we learn is not to forget the power of dua. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ spent the entire night and day praying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help him win the battle. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answered his dua, and that is what has allowed Islam to prosper until this very day. Another lesson we learn is that Allah's power is endless. Allah sent angels in a sandstorm to aid the Muslims even though they couldn't see them. In fact, after the battle, there were some companions that were looking for, their companions who had died in battle, and they noted that on the marks of the disbelievers, on their bodies, there were some like strange wounds that didn't really match any weapons that they used, and it was because those wounds were created by angels' swords, so they didn't match any kind of human weapon. And that's amazing to think that a small army of 313 soldiers with no reinforcements was reinforced with angels from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another lesson we learn is that there is strength through unity. We know that one of the reasons that the Muslim army succeeded despite being more than 3 times smaller than the Quraysh army was because of their discipline and their strict obedience to their orders. So Quraysh was larger and more well equipped, but the Muslims were able to break their ranks and disperse them so easily, and it was because they weren't united. A lot of the clans didn't want to be there. The Muslims were united in their cause. They were obedient to the Prophet ﷺ, and this is one of the reasons that they were victorious. Finally, the last lesson we learned from the Battle of Badr is that we are brothers and sisters first and foremost in Islam and for the sake of Allah. So we're not brothers and sisters in wealth, not even in ethnicity, and sometimes not even in blood. Many years later, when Abu Bakr's son accepted Islam, he told his father that he had purposely avoided him during the Battle of Badr because he didn't want to come across. So back when he was a disbeliever and his father was a believer, he didn't want to find him on the battlefield in case he had to fight him, and he didn't want to kill him. And Abu Bakr responded that if he had seen him and he was a disbeliever, he would have fought him until the very end, meaning that the blood relation is nothing compared to the relationship of brothers in faith. So what connects me and you right now is Islam, and what makes you the brother or sister of someone across the on the other side of the world that you don't know is the fact that they are Muslim. And there's a really important ayah in the Quran about this.
واعتصموا بحبل الله جميعا ولا تفرقوا واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ كنتم أعداء فألف بين قلوبكم فأصبحتم بنعمته إخوانا.
Okay, and that is the end of our lesson. Thank you for sticking around if you have made it this far. There will be a quiz, and I will put the link somewhere either in the video or in the description. You can click on it and fill out a short quiz, like a review quiz for everything that you learned in this lesson. And that's that. We will see you next time on Prime Time. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.
سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك ونتوب إليك.